Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We are going through Part 1, Chapter 5, The Ascent of Sacrifice, Part 1. In the last episode, 68th one, we saw what is the guiding principle, what can guide us in our daily life activities. It is not the mental, moral principles. It is not the vital and its impulsions. They are all fallible. Even when it is refined, they are all fallible. But the true guidance will come from two movements. One is the higher light and force descending from above. But what will help us to discern the presence of that light and force is the psychic being within, but it is 9/10 concealed. We have to discover that. When we discover that, the psychic being help us to distinguish what is the action of the divine Shakti, how to open to her, how to receive that light and force, and how to surrender. And when we surrender to that, then an ever progressive, supple, flexible law is formed within us, guiding us each and every moment, how to guide our daily life action from the perspective of Karma Yoga. And there are three domains of works of knowledge, works of love, and works of will in life. So now we move on to the next episode, that is 69. We are starting with paragraph 7. In our description, you will find the link to this chapter. I highly recommend you to look at the text and read along so that the patterns of Sri Aurobindo's consciousness embedded in these words slowly get imprinted. It's like formatting our consciousness in the light of Sri Aurobindo's patterns that he has given to us. It is natural from the point of view of the yoga to divide into two categories the activities of the human mind in its pursuit of knowledge. So here Sri Aurobindo is beginning the works of knowledge and how to convert works of knowledge into the sacrifice, yajna, where we are consecrating every movement. So there is a classification of all the activities of the mind into two broad categories. That is the first thing to observe. It is natural from the point of view of the yoga. This is coming from the point of view of the yoga, to divide into two categories the activities of the human mind in its pursuit of knowledge. So the mind is pursuing knowledge. And when it comes to the context of yoga, we have to see these two categories. There is the supreme supra-intellectual knowledge, way of knowing that is beyond our rational intelligence, supra-intellectual. There are faculties beyond the rational intelligence. They are, you can say, the supra-intellectual knowledge. These higher faculties gives us supra-intellectual knowledge. So there is the supreme supra-intellectual knowledge, which concentrates itself on the discovery of the one and infinite in its transcendence. So the very nature of this supra-intellectual knowledge is to concentrate itself on the discovery of the one infinite in its transcendence. So there is one divine consciousness permeating all things and transcending all things. So this supra-intellectual knowledge, by its very nature, concentrate on discovering this one infinite, eternal consciousness that transcends everything. So one and infinite, that is the primary occupation of this supra-intellectual knowledge. or tries to penetrate by intuition, contemplation, direct inner contact into the ultimate truths behind the appearances of nature. So this supra-intellectual knowledge, on one side, it seeks transcendence of that one infinite. On other side, it tried to penetrate into the appearances of nature to discover this same great truth. And how does it penetrate into that? By intuition, contemplation, direct inner contact. Intuition, contemplation, direct inner contact. These are all the methods by which this higher faculty enters into the operations, activities of nature and discover that ultimate truth veiled behind it. A direct contact with consciousness of that nature. It is not through analytical thinking we are arriving at, but a direct contact or a contemplation or an intuition. These are the methods that are used by this higher faculty. Then there is the lower science which diffuses itself in an outward knowledge of phenomena. So we have an outer world and a lower knowledge that we derive through our senses. Our senses are telling the sun is rising in the east. That is truth for the sense. But when the intellect collects all that data and analyzes, it will arrive at the knowledge that no, there is something called solar system. Sun is at the center, earth is going around. This is not known to the senses. Whereas the intellect can arrive at that knowledge that is beyond the senses. Rational intelligence can see the larger patterns that our senses cannot know. And yet, it is a lower knowledge of the material world. Even when the intellect penetrates way beyond everything that our senses can see, into the molecules, into the atoms, into the subatomic particles, into the quantum field, and deriving knowledge out of all this, it is still a diffusion. And it is generally, this is referred to as the lower science. And in ancient India, knowledge was brought into two categories, the self-knowledge and world knowledge, paravidya and aparavidya. So there is a knowledge of the world and its operations. That's what normally taught in the universities. When we go to the universities, colleges, we learn about engineering, science, technology, economics, law. All these are how the society works, the external society works. Then there is the knowledge of the self. Who am I? And that is not taught in our universities. Universities predominantly look at this outer world and appearances and the knowledge of it. Spiritual knowledge, it is not yet there. But the future requires this spiritual knowledge, self-knowledge to be brought in so that there is a right balance. So there is the lower science which diffuses itself in an outward knowledge of phenomena, the disguise of the one and infinite. This phenomena, what we see as the trees, animals, birds, mountains, ranges, rivers, people, insects, all that is up. There is disguise of the one and infinite. There is one consciousness, one being, one power becoming a multiplicity of this world. It is a disguise as it appears to us in or through the more exterior forms of world manifestation around us. So this one and infinite is appearing to us as this multiplicity. And our lower forms of knowledge is studying the surface of this phenomena. Studying the rocks, studying the people. Even when you study the people, you're studying their body, their biology, their chemistry, their neurons, how it is firing, and trying to understand how the psychology works. Whereas psychology is a subjective experience, And in self-knowledge, we turn directly inward, going beyond thought itself into a direct self-knowledge, experiential, through intuition and a direct contact, and to supra-intellectual faculty help us to know directly the self by becoming the self. Whereas the outer knowledge is separative knowledge. Everything is an object out there. You analyze it through, whether it is through microscope or a telescope, to vast extent, it is still an object out there separate from you. It is all the objective knowledge where ego experiences itself to be separate from what it is observing. Now, interestingly, science has reached that space where the observer and the observed and their entanglement is beginning to be unraveled little by little. And these things are opening the doors for the marriage of science and spirituality, which is inevitable in the course of human progress. So the domain of knowledge is separated into this outer mundane knowledge of the material world, and there is a spiritual knowledge of the one and infinite behind all things. So the supra-intellectual faculties are naturally turned towards finding that one infinite behind appearances or within appearance. Either it is transcending or within this world. Supra-intellectual faculties naturally turns towards it, whereas our outward going faculties tend to analyze and find knowledge about the outer world and its processes and phenomena. So let's read these two lines together. It is natural from the point of view of the yoga to divide into two categories the activities of the human mind. In its pursuit of knowledge, there is the supreme supra-intellectual knowledge, which concentrates itself on the discovery of the one and infinite in its transcendence, or tries to penetrate by intuition, contemplation, direct inner contact into the ultimate truths behind the appearances of nature. There is a lower science which diffuses itself in an outward knowledge of phenomena, the disguise of the one and infinite as it appears to us in or through the more exterior forms of the world manifestation around us. So these are the two directions the works of knowledge takes. And we have the faculty of knowledge. So karma yoga doesn't mean just bodily manual work. That intellectual work too is karma yoga. That is something that we need to understand. It's a labor of the intellect or the knowledge to go beyond itself and discover either the outer world and the processes or the inner world and the one self behind all things. All these are part of the domain of karma yoga applied to this domain of knowledge, sacrifice of knowledge. We know somebody like Ramanujan, he was laboring in the field of mind and its knowledge, using the supra-intellectual faculty of intuition through which he can find the patterns of the world processes and give to the world mathematical modeling of things with which later scientists were able to recognize here is how the black holes are formed and things like that. That is genius in operation, where his karma yoga was in the field of knowledge, but using supra-intellectual faculty and translating it in terms of the intellect so that other mathematicians could grasp him. So there are two domains, and there are others who use their intellectual labor to understand world phenomena in a limited way, using the normal intellectual process turned outward. These two, an upper and a lower hemisphere. This is a fundamental classification Sri Aurobindo takes, and it is there in the Vedas, it is there in the Upanishads. There is a parardha and aparardha and two hemispheres. That is how the worlds are seen. These two, an upper and lower hemisphere, in the form of them constructed or conceived by men, within the mind's ignorant limits, have even there separated themselves as they developed with some sharpness. So, in the historic process, these two domains bifurcated with certain sharpness. This upper hemisphere and lower hemisphere, or the world of self-knowledge and the world of world knowledge, pursuit of knowledge in these two domains separated with certain sharpness, because they are operating in the ignorant limitations of the human mind. Because of that limitation, this sharpness came into picture. These two, an upper and lower hemisphere, in the form of them constructed or conceived by men within the mind's ignorant limits, have even there separated themselves as they developed with some sharpness. Philosophy, sometimes spiritual or at least intuitive, sometimes abstract and intellectual, sometimes intellectualizing spiritual experience, or supporting with a logical apparatus the discoveries of the spirit, has claimed always to take the fixation of the ultimate truth as its province. So, philosophy is one of the very sublime areas of human labor of knowledge. And it considers finding the ultimate truth as its province. That is the goal philosophy sets for itself. And it is a labor of knowledge, a sacrifice of knowledge. But this attempt of the philosopher has many gradations to it. Many ways this philosophical knowledge tries to find the ultimate truth. And this approach can be sometimes spiritual or at least intuitive. So this approach can be spiritual. Like in India, we will find various sages giving philosophical articulation, and they use spiritual and intuitive process, whether it is Adi Shankara or in contemporary modern times, Sri Aurobindo. They use the spiritual supra-intellectual faculty but gives a philosophical articulation. Sometimes spiritual or at least intuitive, sometimes abstract and intellectual. That tendency we see predominantly in the Western philosophers using very, very abstract intellectual processes, using the linguistic structure. Language has its very systematic ordering and structure, and one can use the framework of language itself to penetrate into deeper and deeper domains of knowledge, but more and more abstract, beyond the world that senses can grasp. In fact, before the modern science emerged, philosophy and natural science was all together. And later, the material science separated itself from philosophy, and it became purely objective by studying the material phenomena and specific scientific methods that are approved and seen as clearly objective, that can be repeated, and you need to study the objective phenomena, and through that arriving at knowledge. In that process, philosophy got separated. It became predominantly an intellectual, philosophical, pure search within the intellectual capacity of the human mind with its limitations, and sometimes intellectualizing spiritual experience. These two happens, a mixture. On one hand, you have spiritual experience, then the intellect takes up that spiritual experience and convert that into an intellectual template. So intellectualizing spiritual experience or supporting with the logical apparatus the discoveries of the spirit. So that's another tendency. There is a discovery of the spirit. For example, we are embedded in this material world phenomena, and through a deep meditation, contemplation, and arriving at a deep trance state, and discovering the splendors of the spirit in the formless dimension, and then coming back to this material world, discovering the gap between the two. On one side, there is the splendor of the spirit, formless, eternal, timeless, unborn. And then this world of forms, transient. Now, how do you reconcile these two experiences? To bridge these two experiences, on one hand, there is a spiritual experience. Other side, there is this world of phenomena. Then many of them use the intellectual process, a logical apparatus. Logically, they derive at certain bridging of the two. In fact, then arriving at this articulation that this world is unreal, only that is real. These are all expressions of use of logic to explain and discover or explain the discoveries of the spirit. When you use logic to do that, but the gulf is there, bridged by logic. So these are all the issues that comes with philosophy in its various domains. So philosophy is sometimes spiritual or at least intuitive, sometimes abstract and intellectual, sometimes intellectualizing spiritual experience, or supporting with the logical apparatus the discoveries of the spirit, has claimed always to take the fixation of ultimate truth as its province. So we can see the Greek philosophers debating and using language as a means to arrive at the deepest truth of things. And that tendency in the West, predominantly we see the intellectual approach to the ultimate truth through philosophy. And in the East, we see the spiritual processes, more intuitive, supra-intellectual faculties that arriving at spiritual experience, but then often trying to express in terms of abstract intellectual philosophy or using logical bridge to explain things. So we have both these domains, and today's world, science is beginning to hit upon philosophy because the discoveries of the science and the technological progress requires more and more values to be brought in, and there philosophy is coming back. But an intellectual philosophy has its limitation. There are other supra-intellectual possibilities from which philosophical knowledge can find its expression. But even when it did not separate itself on rarefied metaphysical heights from the knowledge that belongs to the practical world and the pursuit of ephemeral object, intellectual philosophy, by its habit of abstraction, has seldom been a power for life. So philosophy, even when it is claiming itself to be in the domain of finding the ultimate truth, it had never been effective power in guiding our civilization, our social developments. Even when it is separating into metaphysical heights from the knowledge that belongs to the practical world and the pursuit of ephemeral objects, intellectual philosophy, by its habit of abstraction, we are here specifically talking about intellectual philosophy, without any direct experience of greater divine truth behind things. Purely an intellectual philosophy, by its habit of abstraction, had never been an effective power in the world. So even when it did not separate itself on a rarefied metaphysical heights from the knowledge that belongs to the practical world and the pursuit of ephemeral objects, intellectual philosophy, by its habit of abstraction, has seldom been a power of life. We may consider that all these domains are one, there is no separation between the two, but since it has a tendency to go into this habit of abstraction, it was never powerful enough to transform life. It has been sometimes powerful for a high speculation, pursuing mental truth for its own sake, without any ulterior utility or object. So there is a mental truth, pure truth in the domain of the mind. there is truth across the layers of our existence. And one of the layers is the mental truth. And philosophy was powerful in that space. It has been sometimes powerful for a high speculation, pursuing mental truth for its own sake, knowledge for its own sake, without any ulterior utility or object, sometimes for a subtle gymnastic of the mind, in a mistily bright cloudland of words and ideas, but it has walked or acrobatized far from the more tangible realities of existence. So we have all kinds of philosophies like existentialism or Marxian philosophies, all these temporarily giving some high, but had really not been impactful in society. It used a cloudland of words and ideas or subtle gymnastic of the mind, whether it is Foucault or various modern philosophers. We see the gymnastics of the word, the language. We play with the language. Language gives a lot of possibilities of linguistically playing with things. And it can ask fundamental questions that are paralyzing. When a tree is falling in a forest and there is nobody to hear the sound or see the event, did that event actually happen? So language gives us such possibilities to ask. And a lot of intellectual, linguistic gymnastics can be done, acrobatics can be done with the language, but that doesn't open the doors of greater truth. But we can play with it, but it is not effective. Sometimes for a subtle gymnastic of the mind in a misty bright cloudland of words and ideas, but it has walked or acrobatized far from the more tangible realities of existence. There is a reality of this material world where suffering is, pain is, physical challenges, material challenges, economic challenges, psychological challenges are existing. This has to be dealt with, and these acrobatics have not been very helpful in dealing with this reality of our world. So it has been sometimes powerful for high speculation, pursuing mental truth for its own sake, without any ulterior utility or object, sometimes for a subtle gymnastic of the mind, in a misty, bright cloudland of words and ideas, but it has walked or acrobatized far from the more tangible realities of existence. Ancient philosophy in Europe was more dynamic. And we can remember the Greek philosophers. They were far more dynamic. Ancient philosophy in Europe was more dynamic, but only for the few. So Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, what they brought in, it was only for the few. In India, in its more spiritualized forms, it strongly influenced, but without transforming the life of the race. So we have philosophies coming from spiritual experience, giving spiritualized forms, having strong influence across India. The masses are influenced by philosophy. The notion of Maya, the notion of Mithya, the notion of samsara, and the ultimate truth, you can hear even among the people who have not gone to any universities and college. There is a profound influence by the spiritualized philosophy given by the sages and saints. But even that philosophy was not able to transform the life of the race. It couldn't really save and transform the life fundamentally. It influenced greatly, but did not transform. In Greece, Greek philosophers' influence was very limited. So the ancient philosophers of Europe were more dynamic but influenced few, whereas in India, They were more spiritualized philosophers. They could influence the masses at a larger scale, but couldn't fundamentally transform the society or the race. So ancient philosophy in Europe was more dynamic, but only for the few. In India, in its more spiritualized forms, it strongly influenced, but without transforming the life of the race. Religion did not attempt like philosophy. Now, Sri Aurobindo is coming to religion. So philosophy and religion, these are two major domains. So religion did not attempt, like philosophy, to live alone in the heights. Its aim was rather to take hold of man's parts of life, even more than his parts of mind, and draw them Godwards. So attempts of religion was not to take up the mind of man. Instead, take the life, parts of life, and turn it towards Godward search, align it with God. So this was the nature of religion, which did not look at the abstract heights of knowledge as a priority. Instead, it looks at life of people, daily life, birth, death, marriage, childbirth, all those things, and daily life activities. What is the rule, moral code of conduct, ethical code of conduct, so that it is in alignment with a greater truth. So that was the attempt of religion. Religion did not attempt, like philosophy, to live alone on the heights. Its aim was rather to take hold of man's parts of life, even more than his parts of mind, and draw them Godwards. It professed, but to build It professed to build a bridge between spiritual truth and the vital and material human existence. That was the attempt of religion, making a bridge between, on one side, spiritual truth, on the other side, there is a vital and material human life, our regular, normal human life. Then there is a spiritual truth. How to bridge the two, that job religion took up. It did not take up the abstraction work that philosophy took at how to find the ultimate truth. That was not religion's job. It looked at how to help people to manage their material and vital life. So it professed to build a bridge between the spiritual truth and the vital and material human existence. It strove to subordinate and reconcile the lower to the higher, make life serviceable to God, earth obedient to heaven. So how to make this vital and material human existence, our daily life activities, its compulsions, mind motives, life motives, all that, how to make it serviceable to earth and heaven. Earth obedient to heaven, serviceable to God. That was their attempt. So if you do this, you go to heaven. So our earthly body, earth obedient to heaven means our earthly bodily life obeying something higher. But in this case, higher is religion's instructions, protocols. So religion did not attempt, like philosophy, to live alone in the heights. Its aim was rather to take hold of man's parts of life, even more than his parts of mind, and draw them Godwards. It professed to build a bridge between spiritual truth and the vital and material human existence. It strove to subordinate and reconcile lower to the higher, make life serviceable to God, earth obedient to heaven. So the heaven is a priority, everything else is subordinated so that it can serve. That's how they attempted to reconcile the lower and the higher. It has to be admitted that too often this necessary effort had the opposite result of making heaven a sanction for earth's desires. Earth desires. Human being is full of desires and ambitions. And you use heaven, God's word, God asked me to do this as a sanction, and then go on rampage with that. That was the opposite result of this tendency. It has to be admitted that too often this necessary effort had the opposite result of making heaven a sanction for earth's desires. For continually the religious idea has been turned into an excuse for the worship and service of the human ego. Human ego very easily utilizes, I am the chosen one, and my ambition is nothing but God's command. God has asked me to spread this religion everywhere or conquer that territory, to spread God's gospel or truth, God's command. These are all the blunders that human ego has done in the name of religious sanction. That's the dangerous side this degenerated into. In the religion's attempt to provide some guidance to the lower life of people and turn it serviceable to God, what happened was the human ego took up these guidelines and turned it into its own machinery for imposing itself in the world. So it has to be admitted that too often this necessary effort had the opposite result of making heaven a sanction for earth's desires. Well, I am sanctioned by my religion to go and kill. This happens. It's still happening across the world. This is that religious fanatism that come into. Heaven as sanction for earth's desires. For continually the religious idea has been turned into an excuse for the worship and service of the human ego. So ultimately that is what you are worshipping. You are worshipping the human ego. Religion leaving constantly its little shining core of spiritual experience. So behind religions there is always that little shining core of spiritual experience. This is where we need to separate the founders of religion and their spiritual experience from the religion. So we need to separate Christ from Christianity, Buddha from Buddhism, Islam from Muhammad's core of experience, or any other spiritual religion that we have. Even so-called Hinduism, we have to separate the rishis and their experience. What was their experience? There is always a spiritual core. In Jainism, separate the religion from the experience of Mahavira. So, separating all this is absolutely necessary. Religion, leaving constantly its shining core of spiritual experience, has lost itself in the obscure mass of its ever-extending ambiguous compromise with life. So religion has to deal with the daily life. So people will come to all these teachers or religious guides and look for guidance, and they have to provide guidance. And there is always a compromise when you're dealing with material life, human life. So religion, leaving aside constantly its little shining core of spiritual experience, has lost itself in the obscure mass of its ever-extending ambiguous compromises with life. Ambiguous compromises with life. In attempting to satisfy the thinking mind, it more often succeeded in oppressing or fettering it with mass of theological dogma. And we can see that happening in many religions, various theological dogma. Particularly, we remember in the context of emergence of modern science, It was fighting against the theological dogma, the dogmas created by the church. So more often succeeded in oppressing or fettering it with a mass of theological dogma. So that is, religion, instead of satisfying the thinking human mind and its quest for knowledge, it tends to oppress the human mind. Don't ask questions. This is what our teacher said. This is what our master spoken. This is what the Bible said, the Quran said. Don't ask questions, just follow. And science had to fight against it. Such disaster was much less in India. Indian, even if it is called religions, in fact, in India, there was no real religion in the sense of Abrahamic religions. It was a way of life founded upon spiritual experiences of the masters, one after other. And it is only a realized soul who is revered and respected and sought after for guidance, not the priests. And there was a clear distinction between the priests and spiritually enlightened masters, which was not necessarily the case in other places, in other religions. So therefore, in India, we have a much more open, flexible, progressive, evolving situation where always new masters came. It was never frozen. In every cycle of civilization, there was always new masters coming and recasting the knowledge to meet the modern challenges of the civilization, of the culture. Whereas we see what happened in Europe and we see what is happening in Islamic countries. There was, instead of answering the thinking mind and its demands, there was a suppression. In the early period, medieval Christianity was suppressing the growth of knowledge. And paradoxically, the science itself grew out of small streams of the pioneers of Jesuit priests, and they all went and in pursuit of knowledge. Then the knowledge was emerging from that, and from there the science emerging, and then fighting against the suppressions of theological dogmas and establishing a truth that science was bringing in. Islam is yet to find that rejuvenation, that transformation. These are all the challenges of the world that we are facing even today. In attempting to satisfy the thinking mind, it more often succeeded in oppressing or fettering it with a mass of theological dogmas. While seeking to net the human heart, it fell itself into pits of theistic emotionalism and sensationalism. So religion has to always deal with these faculties. Mind is asking questions and heart is seeking the connection with God. And in that process, it became emotionalism and sensationalism that many of the movements of the heart turn towards God. And the very frenzy that is made into a religious frenzy of the heart and sensationalizing of that whole lot of drama, because of the human heart want a connection with God, and it can be made into an emotionalized, sensationalized drama, and it is happening. In the act of annexing the vital nature of man to dominate it, it grew itself vitiated and fell a prey to the fanatism, homicide, fury, savage, or harsh truth for oppression, pullulating falsehood, obstinate attachment to ignorance, to which the vital nature is prone. So Aurobindo is going layer by layer. The religion has to deal with human mind, its intelligence, and religion has to deal with human heart and its emotional needs, and religion has to deal with the ambitions of the vital energy in human nature. And it is in dealing with the ambitions of the vital nature, it got totally polluted, destroyed, and it became what it fell into, a prey to the it grew itself vitiated and fell a prey to all the fanatism, homicidal fury, the murderous fury that was happening across the religious wars to kill others of other beliefs, that kind of savage or harsh turn for oppression, pullulating falsehood, obstinate attachment to ignorance, to which that vital nature is prone. Human nature is prone to it. And many religions today are political parties. There's nothing to do with turning human beings towards God. It is political party. And these are things that we need to be careful. Even when politicians speak of spirituality, religion, we have to be very careful. What is the core they are bringing in? So while seeking to net the human heart, it fell itself into pits of peistic emotions and sensationalism. In the act of annexing the vital nature of man to dominate it, it grew itself vitiated and fell a prey to all the fanatism, homicidal fury, savage or harsh turn of oppression, pullulating falsehood, obstinate attempts to ignorance, to which that vital nature is prone. Its desires to draw the physical in man towards God betrayed it into chaining itself to ecclesiastic mechanism, hollow ceremony, and lifeless ritual. The very physical activities of man, this brought into lifeless ritual ceremony mechanism, ecclesiastic mechanism, chaining itself into this whole range of rituals and ceremonies, modern life of the physical nature, physical material body. And that's what it has done. So Sri Aurobindo is scanning mental, vital in its layer of heart, the central vital with its vitality, and then the physical. So generally that's a structure with which his sentences flow. Mental, vital, physical. We see it explained here, the pattern. So let us read that one long line. Religion, leaving constantly its little shining core of spiritual experience, has lost itself in the obscure mass of its ever-extending ambiguous compromises with life. In attempting to satisfy the thinking mind, it more often succeeded in oppressing or fettering it with a mass of theological dogma. While seeking to net the human heart, it fell itself into the pits of peistic emotionalism and sensationalism. In the act of annexing the vital nature of man to dominate it, it grew itself vitiated and fell a prey to all the fanatism, homicidal fury, savage or harsh turn for oppression, pullulating falsehood, obstinate attachment to ignorance, to which the vital nature is prone. Its desire to draw the physical in man towards God betrayed it into chaining itself, ecclesiastic mechanism, hollow ceremony, and lifeless ritual. So fundamentally, religion failed to turn the mind towards God, the heart towards God, the vital nature towards God, physical towards God. It betrayed itself and got bound by the limitations of this instrumentation. That's what happened to religions. The corruption of the best produced the worst. By that strange chemistry of the power of life, which generates evil out of good, even as it can also generate good out of evil. Now, this is what happened. The best produced the worst. Religion started with original core of a spiritual experience of its founder. Then it became a system, ceremonies, rules, regulations. And when it is a fanatic form of religion, it produces the worst result for humanity. When it denies all other truth, then it produces evil out of good, and this is human nature. So the corruption of the best produced the worst. By that strange chemistry of the power of life which generates evil out of good, even as it can also generate good out of evil. The very same life force can actually generate good out of evil. but it falls into the other side. It generates evil out of good. At the same time, in a vain effort at self-defense against this downward gravitation, religion was driven to cut existence into two by a division of knowledge, works, art, life itself into two opposite categories: the spiritual and worldly, religious and mundane, sacred and profane. But this defensive distinction itself became conventional and artificial and aggravated rather than healed the disease. So, what religion did was separating the two. There is a mundane life, then there is a religious life. The mundane and spiritual, worldly and spiritual, religious and mundane, sacred and profane, that separation. And we see people living in that separation. I have my religious life, which is turning me towards spiritual aspect. Then I have my worldly activities, that is to earn life, and where I can be a crook, a thief, whatever it is. That is my outer life, my business with life. Don't bring religion into that. Separate the two. That's what happened to religion. In its attempt to self-defense, it created this bifurcation, segregation between the two. Religion was attempting to protect itself from the downward gravitation of this mundane fields of life. And when it embraces business, when it embraces politics, when it gets into the daily, this profane or the daily activities of life, there is a downward gravitation, there is a pollution, there is a degeneration that happens. So therefore it separated into its pure bifurcation. At the same time, in a vain effort at self-defense against the downward gravitation, religion was driven to cut existence into two by a division of knowledge, works, art, life itself into two opposing categories. There is spiritual and worldly, religious and mundane, sacred and profane. But this defensive distinction itself became conventional and artificial and aggravated rather than healed the disease. It didn't heal, it aggravated the problem. On their side, science and art and knowledge of life, although at first they served or lived in the shadow of religion, ended by emancipating themselves, became estranged or hostile. So we saw that happening in Europe, where science grew up under the shadow of religion, then ended up emancipating themselves, became estrangers or even hostile. So science, because of the theological dogmas that were imposed on it, it had to fight against it and come out of the shadow of religion and declare independence, and even became hostile to everything that was religious and threw the baby with bathwater. There is no truth. It is nothing but entire falsehood. Not only science rejected Christianity, its idea of religion was built on the idea of Christianity. So wherever it went, it looked at every religion in the world as nothing but something to be rejected, nothing but falsehood. So when it came to Asia and Asiatic religions that are not, they are fundamentally religious from Abrahamic religions, and it classified various things happening in India, for example, as religion. It couldn't recognize living spiritual core of it, and it had rejected. But now science is coming back after a long journey, recognizing the truth of various spiritual traditions, particularly Eastern traditions, where spirituality and science are beginning to meet. But in the early phase of the science, where it grew up under the shadow of religion, it has to fight and even became hostile. So on their side, science and art and knowledge of life, although at first they served or lived in the shadow of religion. That's what they did in the beginning. Art and knowledge of life, everything was serving religion. In the shadow of religion, ended up emancipating themselves, became estranged or hostile, or have even recoiled from indifference or contempt or skepticism from what seemed to them cold, barren, and distant, or unsubstantial and illusory heights of unreality to which metaphysical philosophy and religion aspire. So, even the metaphysical philosophy was kept aside by science, and religion also tend to go in that direction. So they kept aside all this. It was a tendency that emerged with that rebellion that took place. So let us read this line once again to get a bit more repetition to get imprinted in us. On their side, science and art and knowledge of life, although at first they served or lived in the shadow of religion, ended up emancipating themselves, became estranged or hostile, or have even recoiled with indifference, contempt, or skepticism from what seemed to them the cold, barren, and distant, or unsubstantial and illusory heights of unreality to which metaphysical philosophy and religion aspire. So they clearly separated their ways. For a time, the divorce has been as complete as the one-sided intolerance of human mind could make it, and threatened even to end in a complete extinction of all attempt at a higher or more spiritual knowledge. So the human mind took this intolerant approach and rejected religion and its philosophies and separated itself fundamentally, and in the process the spiritual knowledge itself, it denied the very existence of it. It is all abstract mumbo jumbo. Only that which can be measured by our measuring devices is true. Only that which is objectively testable, measurable is true. Everything else is abstract mumbo jumbo to be thrown out of the window. That's what happened in its extreme stand that science took. But now it is changing. But it is yet to find the methodology of exploration. That's a different line of thought. Let's come back. For a time, the divorce has been as complete as the one-sided intolerance of the human mind could make it, and threatened even to end in a complete extinction of all attempt at a higher or more spiritual knowledge. Yet, even in the earthward life, a higher knowledge is indeed the one thing that is throughout needful. Our earthward life, our bodily life, requires a higher knowledge. Otherwise, it becomes purely an animalistic impulsion, habitual, very, very limited. It requires a higher knowledge. Yet even in the earthward life, a higher knowledge is indeed the one thing that is throughout needful. And without it, the lower sciences and pursuits, however fruitful, however rich, free, miraculous in the abundance of their results, become easily a sacrifice offered without due order and to false gods. So, we see the science and technology providing us material abundance. And at the same time, all that knowledge science is bringing in ended up serving the false gods, the gods of desires, gods of ambitions, gods of human vital. And we see the results in the world, unsustainable. We are destroying the ecosystem, destroying everything. Our ecology is polluted, air is polluted, our economy is violent. All these are byproducts of serving our lowest animal nature, not the finest, highest spiritual truth of our being, because there is no way of discovering that. So all that you know is the lower animal impulses and nature, and you end up serving that. Purpose of life is to satisfy our material needs, and there is no end to material and sensual needs. And when there is no higher knowledge to illumine what is the higher purpose of life, purpose of life become consumerism, to consume more and more and indulge in that pleasure and eat ourselves to death. And we see the obesity growing, health disorders everywhere. Or abundance is created, miraculous abundance is created by our science, our technology. So this is a problem. Without it, the lower sciences and pursuits, however fruitful, however rich, free, miraculous in their abundance and their results, become easily a sacrifice offered without due order to the false gods. Our industrial production economic system, these are like sacrifices offered without due order to the false gods, gods of desire, gods of consumerism, and it destroys, corrupting, hardening in the end the heart of man. And this is what we see everywhere. Heart getting corrupted, people getting hardened because you have to fight for survival in this violent economic situation sanctioned by technology and science, limiting his mind's horizons. They confine in a stony material imprisonment, because the material reality is the only truth. Spiritual stuff is all abstract mumbo jumbo. We have no clue, there is no evidence for it, nothing is measurable, it is philosophy, it is fantasy. So you get stuck in a stony material imprisonment, or lead to a final baffling incertitude and disillusionment. That's another turn it takes. As mind pursues its knowledge through senses, analysis of the world, it will arrive at going beyond the material crust into molecules, into cells, into atoms, into subatomic particles, into energy, and to beyond the energy. Then we come to a conclusion that there is no reality out there. It is nothing but a brain-rendered artificial illusionism. We are living in Maya, we're living in a trap. There is no reality. It is nothing but mental rendering, which has no inherent fundamental truth in it. Any video game is nothing but a similar illusion, and life is nothing but that kind of an illusion without any purpose. There is no fundamental purpose to it. That is the disillusionment to which eventually this, when it is pushed to the limits, where it will reach a baffling incertitude and disillusionment. It cannot fundamentally know. The human mind fundamentally cannot know. There will be the incertitude. Whatever be its knowledge, it knows that it is a partial knowledge. Some other truth will come and disprove whatever it found. And there is a baffling incertitude and disillusionment that happens to the human mind in this pursuit. So that happens to the human mind even when it is pursuing through intellectual rigor. It will arrive at this problem. So yet, even in the earthward life, a higher knowledge is indeed the one thing that is throughout needful. And without it, the lowest science and pursuits, however fruitful, however rich, free, miraculous, in the abundance of their results, become easily a sacrifice offered without due order and to false gods, corrupting, hardening in the end the heart of man, limiting his mind's horizons. They confine in a stony material imprisonment, or lead to a final baffling incertitude and disillusionment. A sterile agnosticism awaits us above the brilliant phosphorescence of a half knowledge that is still the ignorance. If science cannot explore the domain of the spirit, unfortunately, science cannot explore that domain using its objective methodology, because the domain of the spirit is the subject, the pure subject, the self, which is not an object at all, the pure consciousness, which science has defined as a hard problem. It is not able to grasp, it is not able to measure. It can measure the waves arising from a formless energy field and forming subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, cells, life. And there is a whole science of complexity arising, how a society evolves. There is physics, chemistry, biology. Beyond that comes sociology, psychology. These spaces measurement become less and less capable, and you cannot narrow down to simple cause and effect. We are discovering complex systems, and science is touching upon the domains where we are entering the domain of the formless, and there is an exploration. A methodological revolution has to arise. Otherwise, we will arrive at a sterile agnosticism. There is no God. Here, what I mean by God here is not the bearded man sitting up in the cloud, but the conscious being behind all things, omnipresent, omnipotent. How to establish connection with that? There is no such a thing. Out of void, out of nothingness, things are arising. So some of the Indic traditions also came to the similar conclusions. And similar conclusion modern science can arrive at. That danger is there. Arriving at a sterile agnosticism awaits us above the brilliant phosphorescence of a half knowledge that is still the ignorance. It's a half knowledge bound by ignorance, arising from ignorance, built on sensory knowledge. It has a limitation. It will end up in sterile agnosticism, nihilism, because no tangible thing it can arrive at, because the very method is limited. So with that, we have now covered philosophy, religion, science, where it ends, where the limitations are. And these are all domains of knowledge, human faculty of knowledge, works of knowledge. We are looking at all this from Karma Yoga perspective, the domain of knowledge. And these are the limitations, and knowledge is separated into a higher knowledge and lower knowledge, knowledge of the world and knowledge of that which is beyond. And there are supra-intellectual faculties and there are lesser faculties. And lesser faculties, when engaged with this world, it has its limitations. Philosophy has its spiritual possibility. Also, it has an abstract intellectual possibility. And religion, using philosophy, or philosophy and religion separating, or science and religion separating, and science going its own way, divorcing its way, but eventually arriving at an agnostic rendering of the worldview. All these are limited because our daily life activities requires a guiding light. Otherwise, human life will become empty, meaningless, an endless consumerism and transient pleasure, nothing else. So that's a limitation. So the pursuit of knowledge, when we become the knowledge worker, when the divine uses us and work in the field of knowledge, we must be aware of these things. Philosophy, religion, science, arts. When it is turned towards this, what happens and what kind of faculty and activity is required to lift it beyond these limitations. So with that, we arrive at the end of this episode. Thank you for being with me. See you next week.